Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about the politics of printing. On this episode, I have a really fun and wide-ranging conversation with the graphic designer, educator, writer, and political organizer Danielle Aubert. Danielle is the author of a really fascinating new book called The Detroit Printing Co-op, The Politics of the Joys of Printing, which is a richly illustrated history of how graphic design was practiced outside the mainstream capitalist system at this really interesting co-op in Detroit, Michigan. Danielle specifically looks at the work of Freddie and Lorraine Perlman, who were two people who were not designers or printers by training, but were really deeply interested in the political potential of the printing processes. It's a great book that I just absolutely loved, and we spend a lot of time talking about it in this episode. Danielle is also an associate professor in graphic design at Wayne State University and is involved in local politics and union organizing in Detroit. In this conversation, Danielle and I talk about all of those things. We talk a lot about the Detroit Printing Co-op and the Perlmans and how they saw the intersection of form and content. We also talk about how this book challenges our perceptions of design history and highlights the needs in expanding the canon. We also talk about her teaching practice and how this book intersects with that, as well as how politics enters the classroom and influences really all of her work. This is a really fun conversation. Like I said, it's a really engaging conversation that I hope you enjoy as much as I did. Remember, Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you. If you enjoy this show and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that is written by me, as well as previews of the upcoming episodes. If you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, please consider becoming a supporting member. It truly means so much to me. For all the details, you can visit scratchingthesurface.fm/members. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here is my conversation with Danielle Aubert. Earlier this year, you published this book, The Detroit Printing Co-op, The Politics of the Joy of Printing, which I always get wrong every time I say it. I always say
it's on purpose.
The politics of printing or the joy of printing. I always mix it up. I found this book so fascinating for a variety of reasons. And so I kind of want to start by talking about that. For listeners who are unfamiliar, can you kind of describe what the Detroit Printing Co-op is, and then also how and where you first encountered it and kind of came to working on this book?
Yes. So the Detroit Printing Co-op existed from 1970 to 1980. So it no longer exists in downtown Detroit, or I should say in Southwest Detroit. And basically it was a print shop that was established by a group of people who were all on the left. They were kind of like quote unquote movement people or like activists, although they didn't self-describe themselves as activists. And they they basically got access to a offset press, like a big old offset press that had been used for more like industrial printing, and found a space and set up a photo like dark room, which was necessary at the time to make plates, and just started printing stuff. And so one of the most famous things that they printed that like people will have known is the Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. And so they did members of the or they didn't call themselves members, but like users of the co-op actually translated that text too from the French, and
Unauthorized,
unauthorized,
right?
Yeah, and not all.
That was a little detail that I liked.
Yeah, they so what the sort of like main figures in the co-op that I focused on in the book were Freddie Perlman and Lorraine Perlman, who were a couple, and Freddie had been in France in May '68 during the like big mass like worker student uprising, and I'm presuming it was around that time that he kind of learned of this book and then brought it back to the States, and then they were just like super into the text, and so
Mm.
Freddie, Lorraine, and like another couple people. There was like 6 of them. They met every day and translated the text. And not, I mean, what I think is sometimes funny is not all of the members of the group actually spoke French.
Mm.
So, but they were just like super into it, and they, I mean, I'm just like going off on a tangent now about this particular
Yeah, go
book,
for it.
but but they would just like talk about the ideas. It's about capitalism, but it's like an update on Marx, and it's sort of talking about it sort of felt, I think, very relevant and contemporary at the time, because it was talking about like consumer culture in a way that Marx didn't, because Marx's text was written um, like 100 years before or whatever. So this is kind of so one of the things that they did was they brought in all these images, like as they were reading, it would like give them ideas, and they would just get images from magazines, or specifically the image collection at the Detroit Public Library main branch. So the library has this room of filing cabinets that's still there, with like manila folders with laminated cutout images from magazines. So they would just like take those and then like kind of collage them on the light table or whatever, and make just start it, or just drop in images just on their own, all like uncaptioned and all without permission. And so they drop those in throughout the book. And it's interesting because the French version is like very classic typography with like wide margins and, serif typeface and no images whatsoever. But the US version has the first edition in particular has all these images. And then the other thing that's like really kind of recognizable about that edition is the cover has this photograph of people wearing 3D glasses in a like movie theater, and it's like
Yeah.
Society of the Spectacle, and it's kind of like they're the spectacle, and it's so that image is like really iconic and associated with that edition. So I like, I mean, maybe this is actually how I came to learn about the co-op too, was that
Oh,
so this kind of answers both of your the
yeah.
initial questions, but like I knew that text because I had to read it, I think, as an undergrad or something. I kind of came into contact with that text. I don't think I had that specific edition, but I was familiar with that edition. Like maybe whoever taught the class had that edition. So I recognized that book, but I had no idea it was printed in Detroit, nor, at that time, I never thought I would find myself in Detroit. So I maybe didn't even like take note of that as an interesting thing. But then I was at a exhibition like in Detroit in like 2012, I think, around then, and it was about the books published by Black and Red, which was the press that was run by Freddie and Lorraine Perlman, and so they had Society of the Spectacle there, and I was like, wait, this was printed in Detroit? Hang on, that's crazy. And not only that, it was translated here. And not only that, this was the only English translation that was in circulation up until the 90s. So there was like tens of thousands of copies were printed in Southwest Detroit. I mean, then they printed it commercially. But so then, and then I was just super interested in it because basically when I first moved to Detroit, there wasn't much happening here. There was a lot of people leaving Detroit.
Right,
And
right, yeah.
there was like I ended up like getting all these printers with it. I don't know. I just somehow came into the possession of all these printers and like would joke with people like, "Oh, you should just open a print shop where things would be free. Like you could just print."
Mm,
And then I was
mm,
like, "Whoa, they did this in the 70s."
yeah.
So anyway, that's a long roundabout thing.
Well, no, I mean, no, I think it's interesting, and I think I also, similarly to you, had read The Society of the Spectacle in school. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and as I was reading your book, pulled out my copy and was like, "Huh, this is for Black and Red." I had no
Mm-hmm.
idea. Uh, and so, and I think I have like the second edition one, so I don't think there are images in that one, or at least I don't remember the images. But but the way you described that book and their process of putting that book together is actually kind of indicative of the kind of work that was happening in the co-op. And so there was this I think this kind of unauthorized translation is interesting and speaks to the kind of
Mm-hmm.
leftist anarchist sense at the co-op. I think obviously text itself of the Society of the Spectacle and these ideas of kind of consumers culture and things were very connected to things that they were interested in, especially Freddie and Lorraine were interested in, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
um, and then also this idea of, I guess you could say, collage, kind of taking imagery and putting it together in different ways, kind of comes up again and again in your book, of how they were kind of thinking about printing as a way to spread their ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And for the co-op, form and content were inseparable, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
is what
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to say. Can you talk about that a little bit more, about how this group of, I know you said that they didn't really refer to themselves as activists, but activists, left-leaning, kind of politically engaged people used printing,
Mm-hmm.
and how they saw printing as a way to connect to the ideas that they were interested in?
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. So one thing to sort of establish is there was the co-op, which was this physical space that had this printers, equipment, and kind of a setup. But a lot of different groups used it. Or I shouldn't say a lot, but yeah, a lot of people. So individuals, groups, sort of different formations used the equipment. But the kind of constant people in the group were Freddie and Lorraine, and who had black and red, but they were not interested. This is not actually what you asked at all, but they were not really interested in being like in creating like a group so much.
Oh, yeah.
Like so in like a political organization, they were very
Right.
like they were very suspicious of political organizations. So they were like, this is social property. This equipment can be used by anyone
Mhm.
who like will come in and use and maintain it. And especially at the beginning, they had debts because they had to pay off the money they had borrowed to buy the printer and stuff. So they were like, if you came in and helped print this or that, you basically gained access. So that's one thing that I think is so I can talk about Freddie and Lorraine, because I feel like Freddie in particular was really interested in printing,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there's something there, and but then there were other like all interesting groups that kind of came through at different times, that had maybe a different approach based on, to be honest, I think a lot has to do with their structural relation to like wage labor. So Freddie Perlman did not work. Like he had outside of the co-op, like he had an academic job and left it, and um
Right.
hated it. um but there were other people who were coming through the co-op who maybe did have jobs of different kinds, and so one of the things that like drew me to the co-op was also that like they had this union bug, which is like, maybe people have seen that, that sort of circulated more by now, but it says abolish the wage system,
Oh,
abolish the
yeah.
state, all power
Yeah.
to the workers. And that's a really important, like, I don't know, aspect of how they saw what they were doing. Like they were members of the IWW, which is a union of workers, so it's a union of like everybody. um so it's differentiates itself from like the skilled trades
Mhm.
unions.
Mhm.
So it's sort of like all workers can be a part of IWW. So like I feel like the fact that they were approaching their work from a point of view that was like opposed to wage labor, or to
Mm.
that
Mhm.
structure, like
Mhm.
just um led to different form, because like there were certain things like you can spend 12 hours making a collage for this like political treatise that's actually kind of dry in other,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
other ways, and you can like layer all these colors because like you have the time to do that, or you're like refusing to kind of let um like the motive of like producing a commodity
Yeah.
determine how you set your time. um
Right.
so yeah, so I feel like the form, so specifically with Freddie Perlman, um I would say the form and the content are totally intertwined. And in fact, so one of the more interesting texts that I think he printed, it was called The Incoherence of the Intellectual.
Mm,
and it's a text about a sociologist named C. Wright Mills, and
hmm.
he writes in there like about craft and
Right.
craftsmanship, and like I always felt like, or as I was sort of reading that text, I felt like this little book itself is like an example of this sort of um, critical relationship to craft. Like he kind of differentiates. Yeah. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. It's like he feels like craft itself is kind of can be like, I don't want to say it can be like revolutionary, but it's like he's like, okay, when you have craft, or the crafts person or whatever wakes up in the morning and is like, I'm gonna make a book, and I'm gonna get the paper, and then I'm gonna like cut it and make it this size, and I'm gonna use this kind of, and kind of
Yeah.
like this size, how they can like respond to the paper. They can encounter the paper and say like, oh, this paper is weird. I'm gonna like actually cut it this size because it will sit better that way. So like a craftsperson can do that, as opposed to like someone who's in like a factory setting, or even like a
Mm,
designer who's like separated from that part of that stage, can't respond
right.
to the paper or the material conditions, because that's the division of labor like separates them out. And so like Mills, and then also like um Freddie Perlman kind of talk about how that's creates almost like this like schizophrenia for the like it's like you can never be whole or happy if you're like when you're engaging in in like labor that's divided in that way.
Yeah, I mean, you quote Lorraine uh, in the book as saying that Freddie saw printing as like the full connection of theory and practice, in
Yeah,
that, he would have this idea, have this plan, and then at the end of that process, it would be a physical object, and that there was something really important about that connection, which I thought was really interesting.
yeah, yeah, and and actually Lorraine wrote with him some stuff too,
Mm,
kind of.
mhm, mhm.
But so let's say like he's writing, typesetting, laying it out at the light table, exposing the plates, moving the stacks of paper, like over to the printer, cutting the paper, binding, everything, and distributing, mailing, so that there's this kind of like there's like a kind of coherence, um, which yeah is weird. It's like
Some yeah, something else that you wrote in the book that I thought was interesting, that connects to this, that I'd like to ask you about. You write, many of the publications printed at the co-op exude a raw enthusiasm for the craft of printing, attention to graphic detail, and a playfulness with respect to the tools and materials they were using. Members of the co op didn't relate to the idea of graphic design or print production as wage labor or a step in their career development, but as a craft with revolutionary potential. I think that's exactly right. And I found this idea fascinating, that these people, and Freddie and Lorraine especially, I think you were kind of talking about them specifically at this point, um, saw the visual representation of this as equally as important as the content in some way,
yeah,
and used the technology of printing, and used the accessibility of printing to really play with the form of these things, to, like you said earlier, to not just, typeset this in like black and white, whatever they, playing with layering, playing with color, playing with collage. Do you have and the work in the book, and the book is, incredibly illustrated with all of this
hmm
material that they printed, and it's so energetic and lively, and I like, just, in addition to reading the book, spent so much time just looking at everything because it was so kind of fascinating and fresh.
hmm
Do you have a sense on where that came from, either for Freddie or Lorraine, and for the kind of the co-op in general, this idea that the graphic form, that quote unquote graphic design, uh,
hmm
was a key part of their interests?
Yeah, I tried. It's funny because I really tried to ask Lorraine so many times in different ways and about this, and I will send her this podcast. She may listen to it, but like I was, but I'd be like, did Freddie know like William Morris, or like I was like.
Yeah.
Or I was like, in France, did he like go to the Atelier Populaire, that you hear about, like with
Yeah.
those posters that we all as graphic designers know? And she's like, no, not really, and I'd be like, I was like, were you like involved in like the art world? Like, like there's sort of like psychedelic poster design in Detroit in the
Mm-hmm,
70s.
mm-hmm.
And she's like, nah, not really. Like, and he was really into William Blake, is an interesting reference. I think it's like I read that. I was an English major, so I did read that, but it's like Songs of Sorrow, or it's like these like illustrated poems. So and I think that was very interesting to him. She's, what Lorraine has said, and just and I think it has, and William Blake, I think, had basically sort of socialist or like even anarchist politics, so like, but it's like this kind of fusion of the text and the visuals. But what's also interesting with Freddie, he died young. He was 50, and he died in like 1985, I think. And by the end of the co-op, and the co-op closed in 1980 because they lost their lease. But like by the end, he was not really playing anymore with the colors and stuff. Like the books they were printing were like, he was writing, like he was playing with language more. Like the books he was
Mm.
writing were like 700 pages long, and they
Yeah.
had acquired a binding machine. So like, and they were typesetting everything in this typeface Melior. Um,
Okay.
and they were typesetting it at some kind of radical Canadian typesetter place that somebody else
Okay.
should write a book about.
Okay.
but but it was just like full justified. Maybe they were at that point using computers. I'm not sure, but like, so that playful energy was really at the beginning, and I kind of think a lot of it was like as he was getting to know getting to
Mm.
know that Harris offset press. And it sounds like it was a pain in the ass to do it. So it was like, so it may have been kind of fun
Right.
for a while. But yeah, but I think as far as the like union of form and like he definitely recognized or like sought to emphasize the labor that went into everything.
Right.
And that's what
Right.
that's actually one of the things that drew me from the very beginning too, because when I went to that exhibition in Detroit and there were like different things there, and then it wasn't from the point of view of like the design so much, so that so it was like more around their politics and stuff, but clearly they were, the design was there, and the person who curated it was also like thinking about that. But like we were like but I was like struck by how many of the texts explained at the beginning. They had some kind of colophon or
Right.
something about like,
Right.
you know, especially the early things. They were like, this paper was gotten from this place, and it was, sewn by hand by these people, and then it was like this woodblock was printed here.
I mean, it's a good point too, because I said how visually interesting all of this work is, and it is. But what also is interesting to me, and kind of my interest as a graphic designer also, is that all of these formal decisions were rooted in some sort of idea. And so you write about kind of color offsets and how that layering was, kind of feeding into something that they were thinking about, that all of it had some sort of idea behind it
Yeah.
also, which is, kind of fascinating, especially for people who kind of come through the graphic design world. And something that I think about a lot, and a lot of my work is around thinking about how we talk about design history and what is what even is graphic design
Yeah.
history. And it's so, in the graphic design history classes that I went through when I was an undergrad, was just like slideshows of posters and books, and it was like work looked like this, and then it looked like this, and then it
Yeah.
yeah, and it looked like this, and it's just like go through the Meg's history of design textbook linearly. And that's so limiting, and so leaves out so much, and it leaves out a lot on the thinking behind why design styles changed over time, but then it also leaves out work like this that is kind of
Yeah.
outside of the design system. And so I guess the question that I'm trying to get to is how you thought about this book, how you thought about the Detroit Printing Co-op as a piece of history. How did you kind of approach this as something that is both historical in regards to kind of political movements, but also in regards to kind of graphic design history? What was your process of kind of putting all of this together and thinking about this as a kind of history book in a way?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. I think that
You're welcome.
that that is a this is exactly what I was thinking about when I started in a way because I was teaching history of graphic design
Mm,
and trying to think, and you're like, you're there. I'm here in Detroit teaching about these like New York designers or like Bauhaus, just moving around
mhm,
Western
mhm.
Europe. Like, let me talk about the Stil and okay, we're gonna jump
Right.
to the constructivists or whatever. But you're like, you look around the classroom and it's like people who are like fourth generation like auto worker families and stuff and you're just like what are
Oh,
we
yeah.
even talking about here, like what is and but also like I'm like design in Detroit, um a lot of these ways of talking about graphic design, not only the history but even current trends and things, kind of erase the like what's actually happening here
Mm,
or in places that are not on the, like you sort of said the design system, and I feel like
yeah.
um and I think that that's yeah, and I think that that's something that I've thought about a lot, just even myself living in Detroit, like coming, moving to Detroit when I did, and like, you're coming outside of the center of capital and you see like, okay, all the graphic design that we value or that's like considered good, where does it come from? It's not coming from these places that have no money, you know?
Right.
And
Right.
so, and so, and also coming to Detroit and teaching, where I teach, I was like, wow, like students have their own interests and approaches and stuff. I mean, it was like, yeah, and yeah. So you're like, what are we saying is important? What are we valuing? So
Yeah.
I started to, and I started off teaching a lot of like basically lectures because I think that's what I knew. And of course, when you're going to teach a class,
Mhm.
you're scrambling and you're trying to pull it together and whatever. And I also feel this responsibility to teach, like to cover certain things because I'm
Yeah.
like I'm
Yeah.
like I do feel like they need to have heard of Paul Rand or like the Bauhaus before they leave, even if it's
Yeah.
irrelevant to them. But
Yeah.
I feel like a responsibility, in all my classes to teach some basics of graphic design because it's not a huge program. It's like, I mean, there's a lot of students, but there's not that many classes to get all this
Mhm.
in. So anyway, back to this question of the history was that like, I was like, I would try to bring in some Detroit history and,
Mm.
there's Cranbrook is nearby. So a lot of
Yeah.
stuff a lot of Cranbrook kind of gets conflated with Detroit, but it's pretty different. Cranbrook is like 40 or 45 minutes outside of the city and it doesn't feel like of Detroit.
Mm.
Um, Ed Fella, who's like one of the most famous,
Yeah.
Detroit graphic designers, he kind of worked in Detroit, then went to Cranbrook, when he was like 40, and then
Right.
went to California. So I feel like his work in Detroit is less, is less like well known. Although he did actually do some interesting stuff for like art galleries.
Oh,
Anyway,
interesting. I didn't
but
know that.
yeah, he did for like, but and then there's some psychedelic poster designers, Gary Grimshaw and Carl
Mm, mhm.
Lundgren, who did stuff for the
Mhm.
MC5 Grandy Ballroom, also really cool. But I was like, this is like a majority black city and with a really rich political history, and where is that? Where what things were being produced, like, and so what was getting designed, and so I started to actually look actively for examples, and then I actually wrote a text about this book of poetry that I found, that was like designed by this woman named Deborah Jeter. That was just this
Okay.
cool like pamphlet that I found from like, it was like from the 80s, maybe late 70s, and And then I was just kind of keeping an eye out for like interesting graphic design stuff, because what I realized was the thing is the issue as a teacher is you need a story. Like
Right.
you need the research. Like you cannot just all of a sudden start dropping stuff into your lectures if you know nothing about them. So
Yeah.
so
Right.
then but then you realize like all these things get left out of the
Yeah.
history, and then you start to wonder, is this graphic design? Like does this count? Because
Hmm.
like Freddie Perlman never took a graphic design class. Like he didn't know he doesn't know typography, but he's doing typography. So, and then it gets to that thing of like what is taught. And I was just
Hmm.
reading, I'm sure you've read this text by Jacob Lindgren, that's like
Oh yeah.
design
Yeah.
factory settings,
Yep.
and like
Yep.
I was talking about it with another friend here in Detroit, Lauren Williams, who you should interview for your podcast. She was like
Okay.
she's a designer too, but she's been thinking about this a lot, but like about, how does design pedagogy turn out these sort of
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
what
Yeah.
what are we turning out and stuff. So I feel like the thing about writing about the co-op is like I feel like bringing in sort of this like it's like left politics is, so like bringing that kind of work in. I was hoping to sort of like in a way just put it into play, because in a way
Right.
actually one example, sorry, this is, I'm just like rambling, but one example that I feel like
Go
really
for it.
changed for me, like when or affected what I was teaching, was the work of Emory Douglas, Black
Oh
Panther,
yeah.
because I
Hmm.
remember I actually met Sam Durant, the artist who
Mm.
wrote that catalog, around like 2007. He was in Detroit for some reason, and my partner sort of knew him or something. So we like talked, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing this catalog on this Emory Douglas," and showed us images, and we were like, "What? This is crazy," And then he actually like gave me some of those images so that I
Oh
could
wow.
show them in lectures. So I started
Yeah.
bringing that in. Even then, I remember being like, "Is this sort of graphic design? This is more like illustration. How does this count?" But you just like, but then you talk about it, and you're like, "It is graphic design. I mean, this is the history." You know, but we're so conditioned to be like, if it doesn't look like Swiss or like, anyway, so I think we have to force these things in, but also we have to write the stories,
Right.
and and to do that you have to learn the stories. So
Well, something that I say a lot, that I actually haven't applied to design history before, but now hearing you talk about the way you kind of think about that class and even this book, uh, makes me realize that kind of relates because I'm like I used to be somebody like kind of like how you're talking about where it's like, oh, is this graphic design? Is it not? And I kind of just don't care anymore.
mhm.
And it's like if it's interesting and if it seems like it has some sort of connection, we'll take it. Let's call it graphic design. And I think about how graphic design is kind of in everything and like everything is kind of graphic design. And I say that not as graphic design as colonizing, not as kind of every like designers kind of going out and saying like, oh,
Mhm.
this is us, but is actually democratizing and decolonizing.
Mhm.
Um, saying, everybody can kind of do graphic design and graphic design is kind of in everything. And I think that actually applies to history too, and
Yeah.
that if we kind of just say this is graphic design and this is not graphic design, we're going to miss out on the Detroit Printing Co-op, for example. Or I just read this interesting book called The Natural Enemy of Books, A Messy History of Women in Printing,
Oh yeah,
which
yeah.
is very connected. You should read it. It's very
Yeah, yeah.
connected to your book, and I just interviewed them for the podcast also. Uh, and this was all this kind of feminist perspective on the history of printing and graphic design that was full of names that I had never heard of and was like embarrassed that I had not heard of them. Um, and it's because of this kind of clean history that we kind of
Yeah.
try to teach that then produces the same type of work that produces the same types of design, and kind of gets caught in this spiral.
Well, like one thing that I think about, because is like, because I was actually just thinking about this for something else, but like that person, for instance, Deborah Jeter, who designed
Mhm.
this like great cover for this one book of poetry that I just, happened to have found or whatever in Detroit.
Mhm.
Like, I learned had a bachelor's from College for Creative Studies, which is which is like a really good local art school, art undergrad program school in Detroit.
Mhm.
And but I don't know that she stayed in graphic design. And one of the things that I've sort of also noticed is like, even with a figure like Freddie Perlman, he was like doing these really cool things in the early 70s, but then he got more interested in like, like indigenous Native American, like people in Michigan, and just started
Mm.
writing about that, like, and was no longer really doing, or,
Yeah.
whatever. He got
Yeah.
interested in other stuff. And so I feel like there's also this thing about being like sustained in the field, because I feel like
Mm.
like if you think about someone like Milton Glaser, like I he just was around New York. I took a class with him at SVA when I was in New York. Like, you know what I mean? He was at the
Yeah.
AIGA events, and like he's just constant.
Right.
And Ed
Right.
Fella too. Like Ed Fella, I just saw him, he comes to stuff in Detroit still, even though he doesn't live
Yeah.
here. Whenever he's in town, he comes to whatever graphic design thing. And so I feel like there's certain people who like, it makes sense that they are like recognized within the field because they're like they're really of the field. But then I think there's other people who kind of there's a lot of work, and I would say the majority of work, and often really good work, is produced by people who kind of drop in, make a few things. I mean, I should say
Right.
drop, not that they're even dropping into the field, but they make some like
Yeah.
cool book or something, and then they do something else. They become like an astrologer or whatever, and then
Right.
it doesn't like take hold. Um, and then that's what I think about with and it's much harder to like write a history of that kind of thing or
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
thorough, but it's also very rich if you can do it.
Can we I'm curious about how you think about that in regards to your own work and career, because you are also somebody who uh, originally studied English literature and then kind of moved into graphic design. What was your kind of transition into graphic design, and how do you kind of think about that English lit background related to the work that you're doing and things you're thinking about now?
Yeah, so in undergrad, it was like I was an English major, but it was like cultural studies was sort of
Oh,
my
okay.
major. So which was already a little more open, like reading theory and
Oh, okay.
stuff like that.
Nice.
And actually through that I learned about ACT UP and like AIDS
Oh, yeah.
activism. And so
Yeah.
I feel like I got kind of, that's when I sort of got politicized a little bit in undergrad, like more like exposed to things.
Yeah, yeah,
I got
yeah,
interested in like post-colonial theory and like Marxism and stuff.
yeah.
So then for me, and then I got into graphic design actually because I moved to New York and was
Mm.
working like as a receptionist. And then I met through a friend from college. I met Mark Owens. Do you know?
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah. So Mark and his twin brother Matt, and Matt
yeah.
Owens had just graduated from Cranbrook and was doing this like, it was a
Oh,
freelance.
right.
Yeah, he was working on his own, and he was doing this like volume one, which was like this like flash website that he would
Okay.
publish.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know. I was like,
I
whatever.
vaguely remember this.
Yeah, and he would just, it was totally like his own thing. I mean, it was not client based.
Mhm.
And I remember actually being with my sister talking to Mark and Matt, and my sister was like, "What is graphic design?" And he was like holding up like a pack of cigarettes. He's like, "Who do you think makes this? Like, who do you think
Mm.
decided this is red?" And
Yeah.
we were like, "Whoa." So yeah, that was sort of, so I was like, I want Matt's lifestyle where like you just like make your own schedule. I hated going to work. So then that was, yeah. And then I kind of, but also I think because I mean I think a lot of people in English kind of, well, or not a lot of people, but there's like interest in language and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
way it's
yeah.
represented and stuff like that. So graphic design just was like, and like semiotics. I mean, I hate to use that word because I don't really even know what I mean by that, but like, but you're like, it signifies in interesting ways.
Tell me if this is drawing too close of a connection, or if I'm kind of making a leap here. But it's interesting hearing you talk about kind of your introduction to graphic design and talking about being an undergrad, and this is kind of your political awakening, discovering Marx and all of this. And then did you also, kind of like the Perlmans, see design as a way to embody these ideas? Did you see a connection from this other stuff that you were interested in with this kind of visual form making?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think I was attracted to graphic design for very similar reasons, definitely, actually. But I think a lot of us are. I mean, because I think for because if I'm because I so I have to, like, in my mind, go back and think about how, like, at the beginning, Freddie and Lorraine, before they had the co-op, they were already printing stuff, just at other print places, like other kind of left print shops that existed. So, but for them, putting out these pamphlets and whatever, it was just a mode of expression. It was like getting things out there, and I think it's very empowering to feel like you can just make something look real, like, how to make it look like it's real. And I think that that's something that, that's what I remember very vividly, like, learning about ACT UP, and specifically their, like, ad campaign that looked like Benetton, but it was about, like,
Mm,
it
mhm.
was about, like, kissing doesn't kill.
Right,
And I
right,
was
right.
like, whoa, that really looks like Benetton, and they knew how to make it look like Benetton. And and it was
Right.
like, and I was like, that's so powerful to be able to do that. But then I think I learned too much about graphic design, and I started to feel like, oh, graphic design, I, like, read Adbusters, and I was like, this doesn't even help us, like,
Yeah.
like, what good does this do? But then now I'm kind of back in that ground zero place again, because I'm very, like, involved in political organizing,
Yeah.
and I take my graphic design skills sometimes a little bit for granted, because it's like a thing, because I'm actually much more focused on, like, organizing, actually, like,
Mm.
um and I've been just learning a lot about how to, how do you build power, and, or,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's a different thing. It's like labor organizing, or like this kind of stuff. So, but then people need graphics for stuff, and then you produce them, and they're like, whoa, it's real, like, you made it real, and I feel
Right,
like,
right.
it's not hard to, or I don't know, it's an interesting thing to do. I mean, it is hard, actually, to do it well, but I feel like I'm just seeing how, like, graphic design, I think anyway, the part that I was
I
missing for so long was I was just trying to do political graphic design without being part of a movement. You're just like, I'm
mm.
going to make this poster and it's going to be political, but
Right.
then you're like, oh, I don't know, why is nothing
Well,
happening?
that's exactly, you took that answer exactly where my next question was gonna be, because I was interested in the intersection or overlap or connection between yourself as a, uh, political organizer, someone who's heavily involved in local politics, and as a designer, where do those things come together and where do those diverge? And so there's obviously the kind of clear ways where it's like, oh well, you can design stuff for the
Right.
organizations. Are there other places where those connect for you or influence each other or change how you think about one or the other?
Yeah, like, yeah, this is actually what I'm obsessed with right now, or thinking
Oh
about a
great.
lot right now. But some of the more interesting conversations I've had lately are with, another designer, political type of person, Dakota Brown, who's in
Mm,
Chicago, and he wrote this book, or this pamphlet, called Typography. What's it called? Typography, labor, and the wait. It's on typography and the division of labor, and he has been working on a PhD around, where he's writing, his dissertation is about the International Typographical Union, and, like,
mm,
so, like, labor organizing, with what, used to be graphic, this it's not graphic designers, but, like, typesetters, typographers.
mhm.
It's like a major union. So he's been writing about that, and then I also, but anyway, so one of the things that I've been, like, thinking about is what role, beyond just making the flyer for the thing, what is the sort of, like, political like, yeah, where do we sit as graphic designers? And I feel like I think with a lot of these things, it's important to just like not be abstract, just like think about yourself. And so I'm like, okay, for myself, I am a member of a labor union at Wayne State University. Like I'm the representative from my department of art and art history. Um, so I'm a graphic designer, but I teach, and for a long time, I think I just didn't really accept or like that part of my identity. Or I mean, it's not, I shouldn't even call it my identity, but I just didn't. I just taught, but I was like, really, I'm teaching at this school so that I can create the framework for doing research projects such as this book. Like it gives me the support through like funding and summers off, etc. But then since getting involved with or like since really 2016, and like thinking much more urgently around like what about where the left is, I feel like I've become like encouraged to become rooted in my workplace, and you're like, okay, this workplace actually is a major employer in Detroit. My union represents like 1,300 people, and it's like, and to not take that for granted, and to be like, if I feel, of course I feel alienated from my job, that's like in Marx. I mean, everybody feels alienated from
Mhm.
their job. Like we all pretend like we don't really have a job, you know what I mean? And like try to leave
Yeah.
it, and like you don't want to focus on that because you're like, no, the political organizing is going to happen on Saturday at the march or whatever. So
Right.
it's like, no, you have to be like, this is what you do. And then on the other side of it, I feel like, I've been thinking a lot about graphic designers, as like, the practice that I used to have and that a lot of my friends have, where you have a studio and you piece together, you're doing piecework really. It's like you're piecing
Mm.
together paid
Mhm.
work, and then
Mhm.
you're also teaching at like
Yeah.
5 different places.
Yep.
and
That sounds familiar.
and then it's like, what's the political, um what is limiting there, and what is the potential there? And I feel like there's a tendency to be like, graphic designers can't be organized because we don't have a common employer, or there's no common, like,
Mm.
but then I always think, like, that's what they said about the longshoremen, or that's what they say about McDonald's workers. It's like they say that about
Right.
every sector, like you can't be organized. And that's what people said about, professors. And I'm like, thank God my union was started in the 70s. Like I cannot imagine trying to get a union off the ground right now at where I teach. But like, yeah, so I've met other graphic designers in the DSA. So I'm in the DSA, Democratic
Oh, yeah,
Socialist
yeah.
of
Yep.
America. So
Yep.
I'm active in the Detroit chapter. But then I've been active there for like 3 years, and actually, it was my friend who's a graphic designer who got me in. Um, and then I've met other designers now, who are in DSA chapters around, and I feel like as the group gets bigger, like nationally, and it gets more and more
Mhm.
members,
Yeah.
there's more and more just like designers that I know, that I like recognize their names, and I'll be like, oh hey.
Right.
And then I feel like, because actually one of the, yeah, anyway, that's a whole another interesting thing, because there's people designing there who are not like trained graphic designers, but they're good designers,
Yeah.
and it's also like you want that energy of like anyone can do it, but then you also, anyway, so I feel like there's starting to be conversations around like, around that. And one of the most important things, not that I really think, is that a lot of graphic designers see themselves as providing a service. Like they come and they're like, I'm a graphic designer, what can I do, tell me what to do. and
Mhm.
and I feel like, ideally you want to like mobilize those designers to be like political agents, like not, so you want to be like, you come and you help to direct the whole thing, and also make the flyer, but not like come and have that client relationship with an org.
I'm curious how both that idea that you're talking about, but also in a way this entire conversation that we've been having manifests itself in the classroom for you. How do you show students, and I'm not asking you to be prescriptive necessarily, um, how do you show students the potential of graphic design in these kind of avenues like you're talking about, that graphic design doesn't just need to be in service of capitalism, in service of consumerism, blah, blah, blah,
Mhm.
branding, all the stuff that we kind of tend to think about in, that graphic design students tend to be taught. Um, how do you kind of show them that and show them that potential? But then also, how do you talk about the printing co-op and say, look at all this amazing work that's done by people that don't consider them graphic designers, and that this is something that you can know about too. Um, and then, have students be engaged, and formally daring and experimental, and how does that all come together in the classroom? You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Like, and going back to your earlier point about feeling like there's certain things that you need to teach them, which I
Yeah.
totally feel also. And I guess, like, what you're talking about is what I try to think about in the classroom, and I don't know how to bring all of those things together. How do you start to think about that?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. I think
Okay, that
I
makes two of us.
yeah, like, I mean, one thing so I've taught for a long time now, and, like and for a lot of those years, I didn't even really think of myself as being, like I said, like, I didn't really, like, identify with being a teacher, so I feel
Mhm,
like I was like, I'm mainly a designer who's, like, doing all this other
mm,
stuff,
mhm,
and then
mhm.
I teach. So I didn't like, the only actually pedagogy book I did read was actually sort of like this thing around, like, Paulo Freire teaching. It was not Paulo Freire,
Oh,
but
yeah,
it
yeah.
was, like,
Oh,
Ira Ira I can't remember his last name, but it was like by somebody who was, like, incorporating Paulo Freire's teaching into this
okay,
class into, like, this community college classroom in Staten
okay.
Island. Very good book, if I can only remember the name, but
We'll
he
add it in the when you think of it, we'll add it in the show notes.
okay, yeah, yeah, but anyway, I think that, having taught at Wayne State for a while, I've taught at like 3 places, and I think I taught at CCS, which was an art school, which had like,
Mhm,
um, a graphic design program where students would take, let's say, like 30 graphic design classes or something. You know what I mean? It was like the major.
mhm. Oh, yeah,
That's
yeah.
like their major. That's what they do. And then I taught at Princeton, where for a little
Mm,
while, where they didn't have a graphic design program, but you could take like some graphic design
right,
classes. So you would maybe have one student who had other graphic design classes, but like it wasn't part of a everything was like concurrent, like it wasn't really part of a curriculum, because it's not they didn't have a major. And then at Wayne State, um it's like a public, it's like a general
right, yeah,
education thing, and so it's like a big university, and so we have a lot of students, but we're trying to teach them graphic design in like basically 12 or 13 classes, and
mm,
and and it's like 120 students, but basically there's like 3 of us that are full time. And I feel like it's what I realized after teaching there for a while was I kind of panicked because I came in and I was teaching sort of like experimental ideas. I was like, let's make a project around machines and like
yeah,
experiment, and some students really thrived. Like, I mean, I definitely had students that was great, but a lot of students like didn't know what to do with that.
yeah, yeah,
And then to my horror, I would have them the next year as seniors and be like, wait a minute, I just had you last semester, like how
right,
did when did you learn typography? You never learned it. And I was like, shoot, that's on me. Like, I need to teach them how to set a paragraph of type somewhere in this curriculum. And so because so now I'm actually the area coordinator for the it's not a
okay,
major, but like, and I don't know if this is really, I don't know what's the best for the students, but I do feel a responsibility to help them get an office job if that's what they want. And
mhm,
so because a lot of our students are like working class, and
yeah,
I'm like, they do not want to be working at Trader Joe's and Costco forever. They're in school for a reason. So let's try to
mhm,
like teach them those skills that are going to translate to like
right,
that. And then so at the beginning when I first taught, I was like, the more ambitious thing is to teach the big ideas, and it is the more ambitious thing, but I felt like if I don't cover the basics on like type stuff, I don't know where, I don't know when, like I was like, I'm not sure I'm helping them,
yeah,
except for the odd student who would show up who was like kind of already. already knew stuff, and then
Right.
they would like be like awesome, but so I've really like adjusted things so that the way I teach now, and I've teach a lot of classes across the curriculum, but like I teach history is really the class where I try to bring
Mm.
in the most ideas, and we do a lot of
Hmm.
reading and questioning of like what is graphic design and what the heck is this that we're learning, and it's also a place to be like, this is really white like curriculum, like this is
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
western and white, and even if it's, you know you don't realize it, like, so then that's a place where we talk a lot about politics,
Hmm.
and then also I should say the more like I am openly socialist, the less I bring it into the classroom, because it's funny, like before when I wasn't involved with any movement organizing, it didn't feel like threatening or something to be like,
Huh.
I'm a communist. But then now that I'm like more, I don't know, it's like I feel like I don't I feel like
Oh,
I'm more
that's
nervous or
interesting.
something, or not nervous, but I also just feel like I also want to be like, okay, I want these students, all of them, to feel comfortable in this space, and like I don't want to. So I
Yeah.
mean, they can still tell. Like they'll still come up to me after class and be like, "Are you, you know, I'm interested in socialism. Are you?" And I'm like, what did I say? And I'm like, that was just about William Morris. I don't know how that came out, but okay. But like,
Yeah, no, that's an obvious one. Yeah.
yeah,
William Morris makes it obvious.
yeah, yeah. But I do feel like that question about how to bring all this into the classroom is one that I like grapple with every semester.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I guess I haven't really thought about it that way, but I guess I'm kind of similar in regards to like how comfortable I am bringing in my point of view on
Hmm.
things. And the thing that I always think about is that I don't that is interesting. I haven't really totally thought about it like this before. I'm not afraid to hide my point of view on
Hmm.
things from the students, but I don't want them to think that I want them to all share my point of view. And so
Right.
how do I bring my full interests and ideologies into the classroom, but then also in a way where the students are free to be critical of those and of their own. Uh,
Right.
and that's tricky.
Yeah, like I mean, there are certain things that are clear. Like it's like I mean, I try to. I mean, I should say with political stuff, it's more like I'd say almost around labels and things, because I feel like
Yeah, yeah.
they're they're in their because it's like, yeah, if anybody's saying stuff that's like homophobic or
Right,
racist, or
right.
or sexist, it's like, no, 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 that's,
Right, right, right.
we're not doing that, and we're also I try to, and I definitely actually assign readings and everything around thinking about kind of like race and stuff critically, in class, and
Mhm.
we talk about that. But I feel like it's more just because of like, we're in the classroom and then swirling all around us, or should say, I'm on Twitter, like getting annoyed at like Hillary, like it's like Bernie Biden stuff. Like I'm like annoyed with everybody, and so I just don't want to bring
Uh,
that into the classroom, because I feel like people have like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, anyway, but I sometimes wonder maybe if I should or shouldn't. I don't know. But because I'm also like the faculty advisor for the like YDSA
Right.
on campus, which is the like, so they're the socialists, and they're all like history majors. Like that's kind of interesting because they're not. I shouldn't say they're all history, but they're from like all across the university. So that's also nice to meet those other students.
Mhm.
But I think that like in the classroom, one of the I in a way I feel like one of the most important things, maybe I'm saying this although I've never said this before this way, but I feel like one of the more important things I think is to teach them to think of themselves more in that way, like as editors and authors in graphic design, like which, or that's the term that like I feel like people were using in graduate school when I was in grad school, but like graphic designer as editor, where you're like, where you're engaged in the process, and I just try to teach them to think of themselves as like um, active agents versus just let me do your business card because you asked me to do
Exactly.
a business card. So, and I feel
Exactly.
like then that can translate, that can uplift their political I mean, that in itself feels slightly political. Maybe I'm over. Maybe
Yeah.
that. Maybe it's not
Yeah.
really, but it kind of is. And then in the
No, I know
upper,
what you mean. I think you're right.
yeah, yeah, because I feel like that's the main thing is like, and I also try to tell them like, look, we're teaching you these skills, like pretending like there's rules to some of this stuff, but it's just like I just have
Right.
to tell this to you. I'm
Exactly.
not. It's not like I believe it,
Exactly.
but if
Exactly.
I don't tell it to you, then you're kind of screwed.
Exactly. I am pretty sure I've used like that exact kind of framing when I've taught certain things before.
Right.
Other people will tell you that this is something important that is a rule that you need to know. I'm not sure I buy that, but I'm going to teach it to you right now.
Right. Because I think when I first came out of grad school and started teaching, I was like, oh my gosh, like the other classes, they're so straight laced or whatever, and I'm gonna teach the wacky thing. But then when I got to Wayne State, I was like, no one is teaching the basic thing, and I'm annoyed I have to be that one.
My last question, this is a question that I used to end all of these conversations. I'm curious what you're reading right now. Are you reading anything interesting?
Yeah. Oh well, actually, I am in a Capital reading group, which is for
Mm,
Marx, which is a challenge for me because even though I was an English major, I don't I find it difficult to read difficult texts,
mm,
and I don't like to do it. but but my partner is he sort of initiated it with some other people that are some of them are in DSA and some are just other like left people interested. You know, it's like so we're actually in chapter 15, which is the machine chapter, which is like really
oh,
interesting. It's very relevant to the co-op. So I kind of dropped out of the Capital Reading Group for a while, but he was like, you have to come back, like this is very relevant to Freddie Perlman. And I was like, so, and it really is, and it's also very relevant to graphic design um
yeah.
work and practice. So but I feel like but to say I'm reading it, it's like I'll read like 4 pages of that section and then
Yep.
go to the reading
No.
group discussion.
Yeah. No, I've definitely done. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Uh, but there is like another book though that I really like, that has really impacted me, is this book that's called I read it a couple years ago, that's like by that got me kind of into all this organizing stuff, is this book by Jane McKelvey called No Shortcuts. It's like
Mm,
No
I don't know
Shortcuts,
this.
organizing in the Gilded Age or something. I mean, it's not about graphic design, but it's like about how she's kind of like talking about the left and where it's at right now, and she really kind of like roots everything in
Mm,
union engagement, and talks about the like labor movement and how in order to rebuild the left, it's really just like conversation by conversation. It's extremely
right.
slow work, and but that book really like um changed my whole orientation around like, it just, I feel like it was like a roadmap, like, okay, this is what you need to do, because I was kind of just like casting about like we're all screwed, what's gonna happen.
I don't know that book. I love that. That sounds so interesting. Thank you so much for doing this conversation. I loved the book. Um, I loved learning about Freddie and Lorraine Perlman. I am obsessed. And it was so nice to kind of hear you talk about how you think about and putting the book together and how this kind of fits into all of your other work. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, this was really fun.
This episode was recorded on May 14th, 2020. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.